They thought they were arresting just another troublemaker. Brutal force, handcuffs, and humiliation, until the truth came out. Now, the captain they beat is about to turn their world upside down. Subscribe for more stories like this and leave a comment. Where are you watching this from? Jerome Bryant sat in his office, the weight of his badge feeling heavier than usual. As the captain of the city's police department, he was known for his fairness and commitment to justice. Yet, lately, he couldn't shake the growing suspicion that something was wrong. Deeply wrong. Reports had trickled in about excessive force, unwarranted stops, and subtle but persistent bias within his ranks. Official complaints rarely made it to his desk, always sanitized by the time they passed through the chain of command. But Jerome knew how systems worked, how abuse could fester in the shadows while the surface remained polished. He leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing as memories bubbled up. He remembered his early years as a rookie cop, a young black man navigating a predominantly white department where he was both an outsider and a target. Those were the days when a wrong look or misinterpreted tone could cost him respect or worse. He'd fought tooth and nail to climb the ranks, refusing to let the system break him. But now, at the top, he saw the cracks more clearly than ever. The thought gnawed at him. What if my officers are betraying the principles I swore to uphold? It was a question that made him uneasy. If true, it wasn't just a failure of the individuals involved, it was his failure as their leader. Jerome sat forward abruptly, running a hand over his neatly trimmed hair. He'd tried everything: internal reviews, interviews, outreach initiatives, but the stories he heard from civilians were different from the sanitized versions his lieutenants presented in their reports. There was a culture within the department that protected its own at the expense of the truth, and it frustrated him. He could feel the distance growing between the police and the community they were meant to protect. His fingers drummed against the wooden surface of his desk. He needed answers. Real answers, and he needed to see the reality for himself. As the captain, he was too visible, too well known to simply walk the streets and observe. His subordinates would clean up their act in his presence, never letting him witness their true behavior. The solution was risky, but Jerome had never shied away from danger, not when the stakes were this high. It's time to take matters into my own hands. The idea had been simmering in his mind for weeks now, going undercover, patrolling the streets as an ordinary citizen. He'd get a raw, unfiltered look at how his officers interacted with the public. He'd see what the community saw, how they were treated, whether with respect or with hostility. Jerome knew it was a gamble, one that could jeopardize his career and even his safety. But the thought of doing nothing, of letting corruption spread unchecked, was even more unbearable. He stood up, his decision made. His reflection in the office window stared back at him steely and determined. Gone was the hesitation, replaced by the resolve of a man who had once fought to make his place in this very system and who would now fight to fix it. That night, Jerome returned to his modest home, tucked away in a quiet neighborhood far from the districts he would soon patrol. He opened his closet and pulled out a pair of worn jeans, a faded jacket, and a hoodie that had seen better days. Gone was the neatly pressed uniform that signified his rank and authority. Tonight, he would be just another face in the crowd. He left his badge, gun, and radio in a locked drawer, his fingers lingering over them for a moment. These were the tools that had defined his career, symbols of his power and protection. Without them, he would be vulnerable, just another black man on the streets. The irony wasn't lost on him. Even as the captain of police, his skin color still made him a target for the very bias he now sought to expose. As he got ready, Jerome's mind drifted to his early days in law enforcement. He had grown up in a neighborhood where cops were more feared than respected. As a young boy, he'd seen friends harassed for no reason, stopped and frisked simply for walking while black. It was part of what had driven him to join the force in the first place. He had wanted to be different, to show his community that not all police were the enemy. But had he succeeded? He wasn't so sure anymore. The higher he climbed, the more distant he had become from the realities on the ground. He heard complaints from community leaders, saw the tension in the eyes of civilians when patrol cars passed by. Something had gone wrong along the way, and now it was up to him to find out what. This is my department. These are my officers. If there's a problem, I need to see it for myself. As he pulled the hood over his head and stepped out into the cool night air, Jerome couldn't help but think back to the first time he had been mistaken for a suspect. He was a fresh-faced rookie, barely a year into his career, when a fellow officer, one who didn't know him well, had pulled him over, mistaken him for a car thief. It wasn't until Jerome flashed his badge that the officer's attitude changed. But the damage had been done. That was when he realized that no matter how far he rose in rank, he would never escape the prejudice that came with his skin color. Now, as he walked through the dimly lit streets of the city, those memories resurfaced with a vengeance. The streets were quiet, but the tension in the air was palpable. It was the same neighborhood where he had once patrolled as a rookie, trying to make a difference. Now, years later, he was here again, but this time as an observer. He kept his hands in his pockets, his head low, trying to blend in. His eyes scanned the streets, watching for any sign of trouble. In the distance, he heard the faint sound of sirens, followed by the screech of tires. His heart quickened, not from fear, but from anticipation. Would tonight be the night I see it? He wondered. Would tonight be the night that confirmed his worst suspicions? He continued walking, the streets narrowing as he entered one of the more neglected parts of the city. Broken street lights flickered overhead, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. A group of teenagers loitered near a convenience store, their eyes following him as he passed by. He offered a nod, nothing more, careful not to draw too much attention to himself. As he walked, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, not by the civilians, but by something bigger. The system itself, he thought. It was watching, waiting to see if he would have the courage to confront it. With every step, Jerome wrestled with the enormity of what he was doing. He was putting himself at risk, not just physically, but professionally. If this went wrong, if he was discovered, his credibility as captain would be shattered. Worse, it could undermine any future efforts at reform. He needed to be careful. But the fear that gnawed at him wasn't enough to stop him. If anything, it fueled his determination. He thought about his position as captain, the respect he commanded, the decisions he made that shaped the department. For years, he had worked to bridge the gap between law enforcement and the community. But now, he wondered if he had only built a facade, a surface of trust that hid deeper issues. His loyalty was being tested. Should he protect the reputation of the department he had worked so hard to lead, or should he expose the rot he suspected lurked beneath? Jerome knew the answer. The truth must come first. As he reached the heart of the district, he stopped at the corner of a rundown park. His pulse quickened as he scanned the area. If something were to happen, it would happen here. This was where the tension was highest, where the divide between the police and the people was deepest. Jerome stood there, waiting. His mission had begun. Jerome walked deeper into the neighborhood, his steps echoing off the crumbling buildings. The night was heavy with silence, broken only by distant sounds, cars rumbling on far-off streets, music thumping faintly from someone's apartment window. The glow from a flickering street light illuminated the graffiti-covered walls and trash-strewn sidewalks. The neighborhood had a familiar rhythm, but something felt off tonight. He could feel it in the air, the simmering distrust, the tension that had settled between the residents and the officers who patrolled these streets. Jerome adjusted his hoodie, keeping his head low as he approached a small group of teenagers hanging around the entrance to a liquor store. They looked up at him with weary, suspicious eyes. He gave them a nod, just enough to acknowledge their presence without coming off as a threat. The kids exchanged glances, then returned to their conversation, their voices hushed but tinged with frustration. Jerome caught fragments of what they were saying, complaints about the cops, about being hassled for standing around, about being treated like criminals for doing nothing. He listened for a moment, his heart heavy with the confirmation of what he'd feared. The kids weren't angry. They were tired. Tired of always having to explain themselves. Tired of always being seen as suspects first and human beings second. Jerome crossed the street and kept walking, blending into the shadows as he made his way toward the heart of the district. The night was young, but he had a feeling it wouldn't stay quiet for long. He wanted to be there when things started to unravel. He needed to see it with his own eyes. As he turned a corner, the sound of raised voices stopped him in his tracks. Ahead of him, two officers, both white, were standing over a group of black teenagers, their hands resting on the butts of their guns. Jerome recognized one of the officers immediately, Officer Cole, known for his aggressive tactics. The other, Officer Miller, was newer but had quickly fallen into step with Cole's way of doing things. Jerome's jaw tightened as he moved closer, staying just out of sight but within earshot. "Let me see some ID," Cole barked, his hand twitching near his holster. The teens looked at each other, their faces a mix of defiance and fear. One of them, a lanky boy in a red hoodie, spoke up. "We didn't do anything. Why do we gotta show you our ID?" Cole stepped closer, his voice low and menacing. "Because I said so, or do you want to spend the night in a cell?" Jerome felt his hands ball into fists in his pockets. This was exactly the kind of encounter he'd been worried about. An abuse of power, thinly veiled behind the guise of authority. The boy in the red hoodie hesitated, then slowly reached into his pocket. As he did, Miller's hand shot out, grabbing the boy's arm and twisting it behind his back. "Don't even think about pulling something," Miller snapped, shoving the boy toward the wall. The other teens protested, stepping forward instinctively, but Cole drew his gun, aiming it at the group. "Back off, now!" Jerome knew he had to intervene. He stepped out of the shadows and approached the officers, keeping his hands visible. Hey, take it easy," he said, his voice calm but firm. "They're just kids. Let them go." Cole turned, his eyes narrowing as he looked Jerome up and down. "Who the hell are you?" "Just a concerned citizen," Jerome replied, keeping his tone even. "No need for this to get out of hand," Miller sneered, tightening his grip on the boy's arm. "Mind your business, old man. These kids need to learn some respect." Jerome took a step closer, his heart pounding in his chest. Respect isn't earned by scaring the hell out of kids. Cole's eyes darkened. "You interfering, huh?" That what this is?" Jerome knew he was walking a dangerous line. He didn't have his badge to back him up tonight, just his words and the hope that they would be enough. "Look, I get it," he said, keeping his voice steady. "You're just doing your job, but you're not going to win anyone over like this. Let them go. No harm done." For a moment, it seemed like his words might get through. Cole lowered his gun slightly, glancing over at Miller, who was still holding the boy against the wall. But then Cole's lips curled into a sneer. "You think you know better than us, huh? Think you know what it's like out here?" Jerome held his ground. "I've seen enough to know this isn't right." Cole took a step toward Jerome, his hand still resting on his holster. "You better walk away while you still can, old man." Jerome stared back, unflinching. "Or what? You gonna arrest me for caring?" The tension between them was electric, and for a moment it felt like the situation could go either way. But then Miller let out a sharp laugh and released the boy's arm. "Come on, Cole," Miller said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Let's not waste our time on some do-gooder. We've got real work to do." Cole hesitated, then holstered his gun with a disgusted grunt. "Get lost," he muttered, jerking his head toward the kids, "and take your little fan club with you." The teens wasted no time, grabbing their things and hurrying away, casting grateful glances at Jerome as they disappeared down the street. Jerome watched them go, his heart still pounding in his chest. "You got a death wish or something?" Cole muttered as he and Miller turned to leave. Jerome didn't answer. He stood there, watching as the officers walked away, their laughter echoing down the empty street. As they disappeared around the corner, Jerome let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He'd done it. He'd stepped in, challenged his own officers without the shield of his badge. And it had almost cost him. But this was just the beginning. Jerome knew now, without a doubt, that his suspicions were justified. And if two officers could behave this way under casual circumstances, what else were they hiding? He turned and began walking again, his mind racing. He had come here looking for answers, and tonight he had found them. But the real challenge lay ahead. This wasn't just about witnessing misconduct. This was about changing a culture. And Jerome knew that change never came easy. He pulled his hoodie tighter against the night chill and kept walking, disappearing once more into the shadows. The mission had only just begun. The next evening, Jerome returned to the same neighborhood, his mind still replaying the encounter with Cole and Miller. He knew the situation was worse than he had feared. If officers felt emboldened enough to harass civilians with that level of aggression during a routine stop, there was no telling what they would do under more intense circumstances. His goal tonight was clear: to continue observing and, if necessary, intervene again. But the previous night's events had confirmed something for him. Intervening could be dangerous. He kept his hands in his jacket pockets as he walked the streets, his eyes scanning the dimly lit roads for signs of patrols. As he moved through the neighborhood, the cold autumn air brushed against his skin, but it wasn't the temperature that made his body tense. The danger wasn't theoretical anymore. He knew what was at stake. Jerome had nearly reached the park from the night before when he saw a commotion near an old convenience store. Two familiar faces stood beside a dark patrol car, Cole and Miller. This time their attention was focused on a young black man standing by his beat-up sedan, parked awkwardly at the curb. Jerome's heart sank as he approached slowly, blending in with the gathering crowd of onlookers. The young man stood with his hands raised, his body tense. "What's the problem, officers?" the man asked, his voice steady but strained. "You're parked illegally," Cole snapped. "Let's see some ID." The man frowned. "I'm just picking up something from the store. I'll be gone in a minute." Cole gave him a hard stare. "That's not what I asked." Jerome's fists clenched in his pockets. It was happening again. Another baseless stop, another abuse of power. The man was doing nothing wrong, but that didn't seem to matter. The young man sighed and reached into his pocket, moving slowly, clearly aware of how things could go south in an instant. But even his careful movements weren't enough to ease the tension. Miller took a step closer, his hand resting on the baton hanging from his belt. "Move faster," Miller muttered. The man pulled out his wallet and held it out, but before he could hand over his ID, Cole snatched it from his hand, flipping through it with obvious disdain. "Got a lot of nerve driving this piece of junk around like it's a Cadillac." The man's face tightened. "I don't need your commentary." Cole's eyes narrowed, and without warning, he shoved the man backward. "Watch your mouth, smartass." The crowd murmured, and Jerome knew it was only a matter of time before the situation exploded. He couldn't stand by this time. He stepped forward, forcing himself into the officer's line of sight. "That's enough," Jerome said, his voice loud and firm. Both officers turned to face him. Cole's expression darkened. "You again?" Jerome nodded. "Yeah, me again, and you two are way out of line." Miller sneered. "You got a lot of guts showing up here, old man. You think you can tell us how to do our job?" "I think someone needs to," Jerome replied, holding his ground. Cole's patience snapped. He stepped toward Jerome, his hand going for his baton. "You want to spend the night in a cell? Keep running your mouth." Jerome stared him down, his heart pounding. "Go ahead, arrest me, I dare you." For a moment, the two men locked eyes, and Jerome could see the wheels turning in Cole's head. Arresting him would draw attention, but if they let him go, it would look like they'd back down. Miller glanced between them, clearly itching for a fight. "Come on, Cole, let's teach this guy a lesson." Jerome's breath caught as Cole's hand twitched toward his baton, but then something shifted. Cole gave him a cold smile. "Fine," he muttered. "You want trouble? You got it." Before Jerome could react, Miller lunged. The blow came fast, Miller's baton slamming into Jerome's ribs, knocking the wind out of him. Jerome stumbled, but didn't fall. He gritted his teeth, trying to stay upright, but another strike hit him across the back, sending him to his knees. The crowd gasped, and several people pulled out their phones, recording the brutal encounter. Jerome knew he needed to stay calm, but the pain made it hard to think. Cole grabbed Jerome by the collar, dragging him to his feet. "Let's see you talk big now," he sneered, shoving Jerome toward the patrol car. Jerome stumbled again, but this time he forced himself to stand tall. "You're making a mistake," he managed to say through clenched teeth. "Shut up," Miller snapped, slamming Jerome against the hood of the car. Jerome's vision blurred from the impact, but he didn't resist. He knew that fighting back would only make things worse. Instead, he focused on staying conscious, even as his wrists were yanked behind him and cold metal cuffs clicked into place. "You don't know who you're messing with," Jerome whispered, his voice low but steady. Cole chuckled, patting him down roughly. "Oh, yeah? And who's that supposed to be?" Jerome didn't answer. He knew that revealing his identity now wouldn't help him. It would only escalate things. He needed to see how far these officers would go. The cuffs dug into his skin as Miller pushed him into the back seat of the patrol car. Jerome gritted his teeth against the pain, forcing himself to stay calm. This was part of the mission, he reminded himself. He had to see it through. As the car doors slammed shut, he could hear the murmur of the crowd outside, their phones still raised, capturing every second of the encounter. The evidence was piling up. Cole climbed into the driver's seat, glancing back at Jerome through the metal grate. "You're gonna regret getting in our way," he muttered, starting the engine. Jerome leaned back against the seat, his ribs aching, but his mind racing. He had come here to see the truth, and now he had it. But the price was higher than he'd anticipated. The patrol car pulled away from the curb, leaving the crowd behind. Jerome stared out the window as the city lights blurred past, his thoughts swirling. He had known this mission would be dangerous. He had known the risks. But he hadn't expected to feel this helpless, this powerless. As they drove toward the precinct, Jerome knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about every person who had ever been on the receiving end of abuse like this. And he was going to make sure the world knew it. The patrol car's jolting movements worsened the pain in Jerome's side. Each bump in the road sent fresh waves of agony through his bruised ribs, but he kept his breathing steady, refusing to show any more vulnerability. His mind raced as they drove through the darkened streets toward the precinct, the neon lights from passing signs casting fleeting shadows over his face. He'd expected tension, maybe even a confrontation, but not this. Not the viciousness, not the brutality from his own officers, men he was supposed to lead. As they neared the precinct, the radio in the front of the car crackled to life. "Unit 34. We've got a report of a disturbance on Pine Street. Do you copy?" Cole picked up the receiver, glancing at Miller. "Negative. We're bringing in a suspect," he said, a smirk creeping onto his face as he glanced back at Jerome in the rearview mirror. "We've got a live one tonight." Miller laughed, the sound cold and mocking. "Yeah, this one's a real troublemaker. Couldn't just mind his own business." Jerome remained silent, keeping his eyes focused on the world outside. He could feel the weight of the handcuffs biting into his wrists, a constant reminder of his situation. The officers hadn't figured out who he was yet, but he knew that wouldn't last much longer. Once they reached the station, everything would change, but not in the way Cole and Miller expected. When they finally pulled into the precinct, Cole and Miller hauled Jerome out of the back seat, roughly dragging him toward the side entrance. The precinct was quiet this time of night, with only a few officers milling about, most of them barely glancing up as Cole shoved Jerome through the doors. To them, he was just another suspect, a troublemaker who had crossed the wrong line. Inside, the fluorescent lights flickered above them, casting a harsh, sterile glow over the worn linoleum floors. Jerome's breathing remained steady, his mind sharp. He could feel the stares of the officers as he was paraded through the hallway like a prize catch. The walls seemed to close in around him, each step heavier than the last, as he was led toward an interrogation room. Doc Cole pushed him into a small, windowless room and forced him into a metal chair. The cuffs remained tight on his wrists, the steel digging into his skin as his hands stayed bound behind his back. Miller loomed over him, arms crossed, a look of smug satisfaction on his face. "Comfortable?" Cole asked with a mocking smile as he leaned against the wall, arms folded. "You look like you could use a break." Jerome met his gaze, his expression unreadable. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice low and calm. "What do we want?" Miller repeated, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Oh, we just want to know why you thought it was a good idea to mess with us tonight. Why you thought you could step in and tell us how to do our job." "You're not doing your job," Jerome said evenly. You're abusing your power." Cole's smile faded, replaced by a hard glare. "You don't know what you're talking about, old man." "Oh, I know exactly what I'm talking about," Jerome replied, his eyes locked on Cole's. "I've been watching you. I've seen what you do." Miller let out a short laugh, pacing around the room like a predator circling its prey. "You've been watching us, huh? Who do you think you are, some kind of hero?" Jerome didn't respond. He knew the game they were playing, trying to intimidate him, trying to make him feel powerless. But Jerome had faced worse in his life. This wasn't going to break him. The door to the interrogation room creaked open, and a third officer entered, a burly man with a thick mustache and cold, calculating eyes. Sergeant Dobbs. Jerome recognized him immediately. Dobbs was notorious for his hardline stance on discipline within the department, and he'd always turned a blind eye to complaints of excessive force. "What's going on here?" Dobbs asked, his voice gruff as he sized up the situation. "Got ourselves a vigilante," Cole replied, nodding toward Jerome. "Tried to play the hero, got in our way during a stop." Dobbs glanced at Jerome, his expression unreadable. "That so?" Jerome didn't flinch under his gaze. He knew Dobbs wouldn't be easy to read, but he could sense the tension in the room shift slightly. Dobbs was trying to figure out how far this could go. Dobbs walked over to the table and leaned down, his face inches from Jerome's. "You think you can come into my precinct and tell my officers how to do their job?" he asked, his voice low and menacing. Jerome stared back at him, unblinking. "No, I think your officers need to learn how to respect the people they're supposed to protect." Dobbs straightened up, his face twitching with a flicker of annoyance. "I don't like your attitude." "Good," Jerome said, "because I don't like yours either." There was a long pause, the room filled with tense silence. Jerome could see Cole and Miller exchanging glances, their confidence wavering just slightly. They didn't expect him to push back like this. Dobbs let out a slow breath, then turned to Cole and Miller. "Get him processed. Book him for obstruction." Miller smirked, stepping forward to grab Jerome's arm, but Dobbs raised a hand to stop him. "Wait," Dobbs said, narrowing his eyes at Jerome. "Before we do that, let's have a little chat. See if this guy wants to tell us who he really is." Jerome's stomach twisted as he realized what was about to happen. He'd hoped to avoid revealing his identity for as long as possible, but now it seemed like he had no choice. He was already in too deep. Dobbs leaned down again, his eyes narrowing. "So, what's it gonna be, huh? You gonna tell us your name, or should we find out the hard way?" Jerome's jaw tightened. He stayed silent for a moment, considering his options. He could keep playing the role of an ordinary citizen, see how far these officers were willing to take this, but the longer he stayed quiet, the more dangerous this would become, for him and for them. Just as Dobbs opened his mouth to press him further, the door to the interrogation room flew open again, this time with a sharp bang. A young officer, his face pale and nervous, stepped inside, holding a phone in his trembling hand. "Sergeant, we've got a situation," the young officer stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. Dobbs turned, his eyes narrowing. "What is it?" The officer held up the phone where a video was playing, the same video the crowd had been recording outside. It had already gone viral, hundreds of thousands of views in just a few hours. The footage showed the entire encounter. Jerome stepping in to stop the officers, the brutal takedown, the arrest. And now the world was watching. Dobbs's face drained of color as he watched the screen, his jaw tightening. Cole and Miller stood frozen, their smug expressions quickly evaporating as the gravity of the situation hit them. They had no idea who Jerome was yet, but now it didn't matter. The damage was done. "This," Dobbs began, his voice shaking with barely contained rage, "this better be a joke." But it wasn't a joke, and Jerome knew that in just a few more minutes everything would unravel. For the first time since his arrest, Jerome allowed himself to feel the weight of what was about to happen. The viral video was only the beginning. Soon, his true identity would come out, and when it did, the fallout would be immense. He stared at Dobbs, his expression calm but unyielding. "You've got no idea what you've just done," Jerome said, his voice quiet but filled with certainty, and Dobbs knew it too. The silence in the interrogation room was deafening as Sergeant Dobbs stared at the phone screen in disbelief. The viral video of the arrest had already garnered thousands of views, spreading rapidly through social media. The footage captured every brutal detail, the excessive force, the mocking commentary from Cole and Miller, and Jerome's calm resistance in the face of their aggression. "What the hell is this?" Dobbs muttered, glaring at Cole and Miller. "You idiots just arrested someone on camera, and now it's blowing up online?" Cole shifted nervously. "How were we supposed to know people were filming?" Dobbs clenched his fists, his face red with fury. "That's not the point. We're about to have a riot on our hands if this keeps spreading." In the corner, Jerome sat calmly, still in handcuffs, watching the officers scramble. He knew what was coming next. The realization was sinking in, slowly but surely. They had arrested someone far more important than they thought. Then the moment came. Dobbs turned back to Jerome, suspicion creeping into his expression. "Who are you?" Jerome smiled, though his ribs ached with every breath. "You're about to find out." Dobbs scowled. "Cut the games. What's your name?" Jerome leaned forward slightly, locking eyes with the sergeant. "Jerome Bryant, captain of this department." The words landed like a bomb. Cole and Miller froze, their faces draining of color. Dobbs stared at Jerome, disbelief plastered across his face. "You're lying," Cole whispered, though the panic was already setting in. Jerome shook his head slowly. "Call your chief. I'm sure he'll be very interested to know how his officers treat citizens, especially when they don't know who they're dealing with." Dobbs grabbed his phone, his hands trembling slightly, and stepped out of the room. The door slammed behind him, leaving Cole and Miller standing in stunned silence. Jerome sat back, his expression unreadable. "You boys just made the biggest mistake of your careers," he said quietly. Outside the interrogation room, chaos was unfolding. Officers were scrambling to contain the fallout, but it was already too late. News outlets were picking up the video, and protesters were starting to gather outside the precinct, demanding accountability. The chief of police arrived within minutes, his face a mask of controlled rage. Dobbs met him at the door, explaining the situation in hushed tones. When the chief finally stepped into the room where Jerome was being held, his expression shifted from anger to horror. "Captain Bryant," he said stiffly, his voice laced with tension. "Save it," Jerome interrupted. "Uncuff me." The chief nodded to one of the officers, who hastily removed the cuffs from Jerome's wrists. Jerome rubbed his sore wrists, his eyes never leaving the chief's face. "We'll handle this," the chief began, but Jerome cut him off again. "No," Jerome said firmly, "I'll handle this, publicly, and you're going to back me." The chief opened his mouth to argue, but thought better of it. He knew there was no point. The damage was already done. All that mattered now was controlling how the story would be told. Hours later, Jerome stood at a podium outside the precinct, facing a sea of reporters and protesters. Cameras flashed, microphones thrust toward him as he took a deep breath. This was his moment, a chance to tell the truth, to hold his officers accountable, and to start the process of real reform. He spoke with clarity and conviction, recounting the events of the past 2 days. He described the abuse he witnessed, the brutality he endured, and the humiliation he suffered, all at the hands of his own officers. "I went undercover to see how our officers treat the citizens they've sworn to protect," he said, his voice carrying over the crowd, "and what I saw was unacceptable. This department has failed you, but that failure stops now." The crowd erupted into applause and cheers, but Jerome held up a hand for silence. "I know words aren't enough. That's why, starting today, we will implement mandatory de-escalation training and racial sensitivity workshops for every officer in this department. We will establish a civilian oversight committee to hold us accountable, and the officers involved in my arrest will be suspended pending a full investigation." The reporters fired off questions, but Jerome remained calm, answering each one with honesty and transparency. He knew not everyone would be satisfied with his words. Some would call him a traitor to his own department, while others would see him as a hero. But he didn't care. He wasn't doing this for approval. He was doing it because it was the right thing to do. Inside the precinct, the atmosphere was tense. Some officers whispered angrily about Jerome's speech, calling him a sellout. Others nodded in quiet agreement, grateful that someone was finally addressing the problems that had festered for too long. Jerome knew change wouldn't come easily. He would face resistance from within the department and criticism from outside. But he also knew he wasn't alone. Community activists, journalists, and even a few of his fellow officers had already pledged their support. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of meetings, press conferences, and policy changes. Officers were required to attend new training sessions, and the oversight committee was quickly established. Those who refused to comply were dismissed from the force. Cole and Miller were among the first to go. An internal investigation uncovered a history of complaints against both officers. Complaints that had been buried for years. They were stripped of their badges and quietly escorted out of the precinct, their careers in law enforcement over. On a cool autumn evening, weeks after the reforms had begun to take shape, Jerome found himself walking through the same neighborhood where everything had started. He wore the same old jeans and jacket, his hands tucked into his pockets as he strolled along the cracked sidewalks. But this time the tension in the air was different. People nodded at him as he passed, some offering small smiles, others simply acknowledging him with a glance. He wasn't just another stranger anymore. He was someone who had earned their trust. Jerome stopped at the park, the same spot where he had first confronted Cole and Miller. He stood there for a moment, taking it all in. There was still work to be done. There always would be. But for the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful. A small group of kids played basketball nearby, their laughter filling the air. Jerome smiled, watching them for a moment before turning to leave. As he walked away, a voice called out from behind him, "Hey, Captain!" Jerome turned to see one of the teenagers from the night of his arrest, grinning at him from across the park. Jerome gave him a small wave, then continued on his way, the weight on his shoulders a little lighter than before. Change was slow, but it was happening, and that was enough. The story concludes with Jerome having initiated meaningful reforms and earned the respect of both the community and his peers. His journey is far from over, but he walks away knowing that he has taken the first step toward building a better, more just department. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new stories and find out what's coming next. And if you're already with us, don't forget to give us a like. Keep watching for more videos. There are many more exciting stories to come. Where are you watching this right now? Write it in the comments.